Padma Vibhushan Montek Singh Ahluwalia is the guest on today's podcast. जब हम इकोनॉमिक लिबरलाइजेशन की बात करते हैं 1991 तो दो नाम याद आते हैं. एक तो फॉर्मर प्राइम मिनिस्टर डॉक्टर मनमोहन सिंह एंड द सेकंड वाज मॉन्टेक सिंह आलूवालिया. आज का पॉडकास्ट इज अ डीप डाइव ऑन द जर्नी ऑफ मॉन्टेक सिंह आलूवालिया, his relationship with Dr. Manmohan Singh, and some of the most important, aspects and parameters today about GDP, about, the huge disparity that, India wealth की जो disparity है और भी जो important points है economics related आज हमने podcast पे discuss किए हैं. मेरे लिए बहुत fanboy moment था because जब से, हमने थोड़ी बहुत politics समझने की कोशिश की है, India को समझने की कोशिश की है, तो we've been following Montek Singh Ahluwalia when it comes to economics. It was a pleasure recording this podcast and bringing this content to you. Please do subscribe to our channel because जितने लोग subscribe करेंगे उतना ही हमें motivation मिलेगी अच्छा meaningful content आप तक लेके आने के लिए. Montek Singh Ahluwalia on the journey with Simarpreet Singh.
Sir, 1943 Rawalpindi you were born, है ना? Son of a clerk, आपके father was a clerk at the Defense Accounts Department. So did you ever think you'll become one of the most celebrated economists in the world?
Well, first of all, I don't think I'm one of the most celebrated economists in the world. Nobody ever thinks when they're very, very young that far. I would say that I didn't even know that I was going to be an economist until I was maybe 17 or 18 years old. So, but one thing my generation be conscious of is that we're growing up in an independent India. I mean, independence was perhaps the only thing that as a kid we were aware of, which made a difference between us and, let's say, my parents.
But sir, were there any kind of early inspirations? What I wanted to ask is you of course grew up in an independent India, but you were born in Rawalpindi pre-partition. But when you say 17, 18, you wanted to be into public policy, economics and things like that. But were there any early inspiration at home? Because when we were researching our team, तो इसके बारे में आपने ज़्यादा बात नहीं की हुई है your early life.
Yeah, first of all, I think I'm maybe intellectually not oriented towards what you might call identifying inspirations. I mean, there are many people who I was inspired by for the dedication that they showed to the country. But they weren't economists. I mean, Mahatma Gandhi, obviously, certainly Pandit Nehru. We were all very inspired by Vallabhbhai Patel, who actually put the country together. I mean, there were 500 princely states at the time of independence, and weaving them into one was a major achievement, and others also. But I don't think I had in mind professional inspirators or inspirers until much later. Probably on the professional side, I guess Manmohan Singh is one person that I kind of identified as, well, look, that's the kind of career I'd like to have. So he was clearly one. And I was fortunate because I got to know him personally.
Yeah.
So there was a professional relationship, but there was a parallel also personal relationship which developed between sort of my family, Ishar and me, and his family. So it's difficult to judge whether that's a matter of inspiration or just that, you know the person, so you get to know them, you get to talk to them informally.
Yeah. Sir, ये वाले topic पे भी you've not spoken in detail your relationship with Dr. Singh. So you mentioned about Dr. Manmohan Singh, right? I was born in 1990. I grew up during that time where, when you're 14, 15, you start to understand politics and public life. And 2004, when Dr. Manmohan Singh became the Prime Minister and led the country for 10 years, उनके बारे में बड़ा कुछ बोला जाता है, right? His public image, very reserved. But 91, when I look back history, he gave the famous passionate speech about Sarfaroshi ki Tamanna when liberalization happened. So you talked about him as an inspiration. Can you just talk more about your relationship with the Prime Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh?
Well, I mean, I first met Dr. Manmohan Singh way back in I'm forgetting now exactly when, but sometime in 1970 or 1969, when Ishwar and I were not married then, but we visited. And you know Udham Singh, who was head of department of Khalsa College, head of the economics department. Udham was actually quite a left-oriented economist, and he had some grave doubts about me because he said, "Ye to World Bank se aaya hai, he'll have all the wrong ideas." But maybe because I was a Sikh, he was willing to forgive that. So he said to Isha that, "Why don't I invite you and Montek?" I mean, we were not married then. To dinner, and I'll also invite Manmohan Singh, who was then in the Delhi School of Economics. He was not in government. So that's when I first met him. And, you know, he's not a person who engages in small talk. So, I mean, he's a fantastic listener in the sense that, you know, there's not much that he doesn't get when people are talking about things. But when you say reserved, I think he holds back from an overt bonhomie, you know. But over time, when I got to know him better, you know, he used to visit Washington, D.C. Every year as finance secretary for the meetings of the World Bank and IMF. And Isha and I were both in Washington, D.C. I mean, I was working for the World Bank. She was for the IMF. So we would take the time out to invite him home and chat with him, etc. Even then, you know, he was, when you wanted to get him involved in something that he felt, you know, he could give guidance, he was very, very good. But you couldn't get gossip from him, okay, what happened in the World Bank meeting and that sort of thing, you know. And I think he was very critical in guiding me. Because I said, look, I want to come back. I mean, this is fine, World Bank. I get to learn what other countries are doing. But you can't do economic policy on a hands-on basis except in your own country. I mean, World Bank, you go there, you say some obvious things. They're very nice to you because you're going to give them money. And then you feel you've had a discussion. That's fine. And that's useful also. But if you want to impact policy, you can only do it in your own country because there you're a citizen and it's your country and this is your view. People may not like it, but, you know, nobody says, why are you saying this? They may say you're wrong. So Dr. Singh said that, look, there is a job coming up in the finance ministry. In those days, when you were an economic advisor, the UPSC used to advertise. And you applied. Everybody in India could apply. Any Indian anywhere could apply. So why didn't you apply for the job? Because your qualifications are such that you are very likely to get it. So I applied. And
this is 1979.
No. This is, I must have applied in 1969 or something.
Okay, 69.
And
68 to 70.
Must have applied in. I'm getting this all
because World Bank, you were from 68 to 79, right?
That's right. So I must have applied in something like 78 or 77. Maybe in 77. But you know, our oldest son, Pavan, was born in 77. So I said, look, I accept this, but could you delay my coming? Because, you know, I want to be sure that I can't leave my wife when she's expecting a kid and so on. And they delayed it by a year and a half or so. And then we finally came back in mid-79 to Delhi as economic advisor. And I was greatly looking forward, you know, to working under Manmohan Singh because he was then secretary. But, you know, 6 months later, he got transferred as member secretary planning commission. So I never got a chance to actually work at that time. In 6 months we were there. But that was by then the Morarji Desai government had fallen and interim government was there and we knew an election was coming. So that was a 6-month period of adjustment without having much work to do. When the new government was formed, that was with Mrs. Gandhi as Prime Minister. When she came back after the election, he was sort of promoted as member secretary in the Planning Commission. And we got a new person at the head of the department. That's okay. In government, that happened.
Mm.
But I retained the contact
Mm.
with Manmohan and would go to him and discuss
Mm.
aspects of economic policy.
Yeah.
On economic policy, he's very forthcoming. And partly because I was in government. So, you know, in a way, it was his way of guiding me, saying this, be cautious here or not cautious there, whatever. And we got to know each other. Then he was promoted as Governor, Reserve Bank of India.
Yeah.
In which context, since I was in the finance ministry, I mean, the Reserve Bank was important for us, but normally an economic advisor would not get the time of day with the governor.
Yeah.
Because I knew him,
Dr. Singh, yeah.
when I visited Bombay, I mean, he would also give me time so I could go and chat and so on.
Yeah. So can we sort of say that, you know, of course, when you sort of did your, graduation at St. Stephen's, then went down, spent time at University of Oxford, then worked at the World Bank for almost 11 years. So can we say that Dr. Manmohan Singh was one of the main reasons of you shifting back to India?
Well, certainly the last. I mean, when I was in Oxford and the World Bank, I don't think he had much impact on what I was doing.
Sure.
But he became critical in my life when I decided I wanted to go back. And he guided me on how to do it.
Yeah.
And also encouraged me that, look, it's tough. And I mean, the obvious thing is that you're giving up a lot of money.
Yeah.
And in our case, since my wife also had an equally good job, we would be giving up twice as much.
Yeah.
But what I told him is that, look, I mean, we've been here, we've saved some, and the purpose is not to keep earning money. I want to do something useful. And I think Isha had a similar motivation because, you know, she wanted to do research. She didn't want to join government. Okay. As a matter of fact, he offered her, would you like somewhere in government? No. I want to be an independent researcher. I want to criticize government if I can. And he respected that.
Yeah.
Also, I think our second son, Aman, was about to be born. And she wanted him to be born in India. And she wanted the older one also to be brought up in India because she rightly, I think, felt that you cannot bring up children in America for 15 years and then somehow expect them
come to India
to take an interest. They'll come as a tourist, but basically they're lost. And so if you want to give them the opportunity to actually work in India and be an Indian, you got to bring them up in India.
There is a Desi term, ABC, that American-born Desi, confused Desi, something of that sort.
She didn't want our kids to be American-born, confused Desi.
So before I, jump into the 1991 and then we talk more deeper into policy-related questions, I just want another 2 minutes on Dr. Manmohan Singh. I have a couple of things, right? So when I've seen Dr. Singh, right, on television, like 10 years as a prime minister, तो आपने सर इतना पर्सनली उनको जाना है, राइट? तो मेरे को हमेशा ही इंक्विजिटिव था कि उनको कभी गुस्सा चढ़ा है सर अभी 10 साल में, like as prime minister you worked and 91 also, like was he always very calm and composed?
Yes, I think he is basically a very calm and composed. I'm sure there were many.
ऐसे नहीं हुआ फोन करके उसको गुस्सा कर रहे हैं और डांट रहे हैं, कभी ऐसे नहीं हुआ?
No, I've never seen it. That's just not him. Look, I'm quite sure that he has strong views on many things.
Right.
But that's not his style at all.
Right.
Basically.
Right. Sir, 79 you come back, of course, major inspiration being Dr. Singh and other. 79 to 91. Very interesting time in India's history, right? 84 happened. A lot of other things happened during that time. But May 1991, right? I was 1 year old at that time. May 1991, Rajiv Gandhi gets assassinated. There's a new Prime Minister, P.V. Narasimha Rao, gets elected on 21st of June 1991. Lot of young people don't know what happened in 1991, right? They know the economic reforms, liberalization opened, but India was going through one of the most, crazy time, right? Before you explain the economic crisis that India was in 1991, can you just explain the political environment India was in when the Prime Minister Narasimha Rao took over?
The assassination of a principal opposition leader, Rajiv Gandhi, bound to be a kind of traumatic event. Okay.
Mm.
And the fact that he had been former prime minister makes it even more so.
Mm.
Then the election happened. There was a bit of a time gap between the two. I mean, by then the politics was quite interesting in the sense that we knew that we had gone through the VP Singh period of a coalition that was somewhat unstable. So there was a concern, how will this new government turn out? When Narasimha Rao got elected, I mean, he wasn't even a candidate for the prime ministership. I mean, he was packing to go home, according to the news. But then he was brought back in and so on. And, when there was no Rajiv Gandhi and Mrs. Gandhi refused to step in, the Congress party zeroed in on Narasimha Rao. This has been written about by Sanjay Baru quite a bit. So you can go to history for that. I think people accepted the fact that Narasimha Rao was not an untried person. I mean, he had been in government for years. Congress had rallied behind him. So they were looking forward to see what would happen in the election. The election produced not a firm majority, but a coalition which he put together. By then, of course, the fact that he put together a coalition was no surprise, because we'd had coalitions before. The real question is that the previous coalition had kind of fallen apart very quickly. And the big issue then was the crisis. I mean, there was no money with the Reserve Bank of India. The total reserves were down to about a month or even 2 weeks of imports. So naturally, at least for us economists, and I think for most people, there was a lot of focus on what Narasimha Rao would do. I think one of the most important things Narasimha Rao did, and we must give him credit for that, is that, he realized that the economy cannot just be left to the senior-most politician. Running an economy in a period of crisis puts a huge pressure on government. He was not an economist. And so, as many people have written, he thought of two people, I.G. Patel, Manmohan Singh. I don't know what actually happened, but in the end, it was Manmohan Singh who was chosen. And most people didn't know Manmohan Singh. I mean, the public only viewed him as just a technocrat, okay? And he held very important jobs, but nobody knew exactly what he would do. So he was really on test. I would say that as an economist, I knew what his thinking was. I was really very excited that Narasimha Rao chose Manmohan Singh, because I thought that Narasimha Rao, by choosing Manmohan Singh, had recognized that we needed to do something different from what we had been doing earlier. And by and large, what Manmohan Singh did and unleashed and so on was a significant difference. Now, today, people recognize that the economic reforms began in 1991. Then the whole focus is, are they continuing? What's happening now? What do we do for the future? But the importance of 1991, at least amongst knowledgeable people, even those who were not alive in 1991, is now recognized. And I think there's no question that while we had been fiddling around at the edges earlier, and even Mrs. Gandhi and certainly later on Rajiv Gandhi took some steps. I mean, Mrs. Gandhi took some very limited steps. Rajiv Gandhi laid out very clearly that we need a system change. When he became prime minister in 1985, in his first speech in parliament, he said, how do we expect to compete with other countries if we are running systems that are 25 years out of date? And he also coined this getting ready for the 21st century. So it created an image that, look, a big change on the way. I mean, he made a couple of important changes, but I don't think he was able to do what he wanted because the Bofors scandal completely derailed everything. Okay? So along comes Manmohan Singh under Narasimha Rao, and I think he really outlined changes in many dimensions, which at that time, even the Congress party really didn't understand or was not in favor of. But, he was able to explain to them that, listen, we've talked about it before. And after all, Rajiv Gandhi had said all these things. We want to liberalize the economy. You know, the recognition that excessive government control is damaging was an important message. And I think Narasimha Rao was aware of the implications of these things. I don't think he would himself have been able to put together the whole package. In my book, Backstage, I have said that, you know, he deserves credit for recognizing that you need an architect to do these things, and he deserves credit for choosing a good architect. I mean, he could have chosen a technocrat who had all the wrong ideas. So both of those things he deserves credit.
As a leader, to select a person who can execute that. Sir, before we actually get into what was done, and I want to talk about that famous speech also, like, I still think a lot of people of my generation really don't know how closed India was. Kitna band tha India 91 se pehle, right? Independence ke baad 91 tak, can you just very simply explain how India was kitna close tha India 91 se pehle? And secondly, can you also explain what India was going through from an economic crisis angle?
You see, you make an important point that India was very closed. In fact, in one of the documents I wrote actually for VP Singh was to make the point that, look, the rest of the world is opening up. Communism has collapsed in Eastern Europe. All developing countries are opening up, and we are closed. India was among the three most closed economies at the time. And the others were North Korea, Cuba, and I forget, Vietnam at that time. Okay. The degree of control was ridiculous. I mean, if you were like Rahul Bajaj, who was one of our, most distinguished industrialists, he used to make fun of the system by saying that, look, I produce a scooter that every Indian wants. Every middle-class Indian wants to be given a scooter on his marriage. In those days, they weren't given cars, scooters. And the demand is huge. And the waiting list is 10 years. And I cannot increase my production because the licensed capacity cannot be exceeded. If I do that, I'll go to jail. And, you know, people today cannot imagine the degree of scarcity. When I came back in 1979, we settled down and we said, look, we must get we got a telephone automatically because we were in government. If you were in the private sector, it would take 10 years to get a telephone.
Wow, can't even
There
think
were
of
no
it, na?
mobiles, there were only landlines, but the waiting list was huge. Because the telecom department was a monopoly. And secondly, people wrongly believed that telecom is a luxury good. I mean, that is what... Rajiv Gandhi was the first person to recognize that this is wrong. But he was only able to introduce public call box, PCOs. Sam Petroda was doing the telecom thing. And that was the first time that if you went off from a village to, say, Delhi, you could go to a public call box, which was privately run, and call up the guy in your village, the local, whatever, shopkeeper who may have had a telephone. And said, "Bhai, us ghar se isko bula do yahan." And then he would say, "Hold on," and they would call someone and say, "Bhai, your brother or your uncle or something is calling from Delhi." That's but that was itself a miracle because earlier there was no connectivity. And Sam Petroda once told me that the number of telephones that were dead and didn't get repaired on time was huge. And he realized it one day because he was going to some place and there was a funeral procession and with people carrying the stretcher on which the body is normally kept. And he said, "Ye kya ho raha hai?" He says, "Ab inka phone dead hai, so they are burying the phone." So and by the way, when I came back, as I was saying, I wanted a car. And there were two cars, Ambassador and the Fiat. And long waiting lines. But there was something called a manufacturer's quota. So they could bypass the line. Now, actually, because I was in government as a joint secretary, they gave me from the manufacturer's quota. But actually, that thing was also sold. Because if you had a manufacturing quota and you were told, "Kebhi, you can join the line, it takes 10 years or something,"
Yeah.
Or if you pay so much, we'll give you from the manufacturing quota.
Yeah.
These are just a few examples. I knew someone very well who was a small-scale manufacturer. And, in those days, to get raw material, you had to get an import license for virtually everything.
Yeah.
So this guy was playing golf all the time. So I said, how come you're not working? This is a weekday. Because he asked me to come for lunch. I said, how come you're not working? He said, no. I get these licenses and I just sell them. And I make enough money from that. I don't actually run a factory. He had a factory somewhere in Noida, but was living on basically getting licenses and selling them.
जो license Raj का time बोलते
that
हैं.
is, people cannot imagine. I mean, look, the thing we were most competitive in are the smaller light industrial things, garments, toys, electronics. All this was reserved for the small scale sector. Now, elsewhere in the world, if you want to penetrate the European market or the American market, buyers would come and say, look, we want to order 20,000 T-shirts, maybe even more. Most of our guys could not produce more than 500 T-shirts because they were all small scale. So we actually crippled the sector which could have been export oriented.
Yeah, वो हमारा strength बन सकता था. That could be
we
strength,
did it because we felt this is more labor intensive.
Yeah.
Whereas in order to produce a larger quantity, they would have to mechanize.
Okay.
But what we failed to realize is that while the sector remained labor intensive, it also remained small. Had we modernized it, it could have grown 50 times as China did. So frankly, the policies were just stupid. And I was aware of that when I came back because I was aware of what's happening in the world. People today take all these things for granted.
Yeah.
And actually, the people are now much more aware that protection of one industry is at the cost of another.
Sure.
Just a couple of days ago in the newspapers, there was a news item saying that the steel industry is saying, okay, we are subject to competition and you must raise duties. Okay. I think it's unfortunate that in the last 4 or 5 years, we have been raising duties. We have reversed a 30-year or 25-year record of successive governments lowering duties after the 1991 reforms. This reversal took place in 2017. The news item said the steel fellows want a higher duty. Today's news item says the MSMEs are protesting because steel is a raw material for them. And they say if you raise duties, we'll have to pay a higher price for our raw material. We'll become uncompetitive. And I think this was so obvious, and it was actually mentioned in many reports. The Abid Hussain committee, somewhere in the mid-80s, had made a recommendation that we should de-reserve small-scale industries because if we want these industries to export, then they need to modernize or they need to expand. And you can't limit the investment that is done by each unit. But somehow the politics prevented that from happening.
And we can't even just since I was asking how closed India was before 91, like today, born in the 90s, I can't even think of, waiting for a telephone for 10 years or having just 2 cars. Today, the whole scenario is about you have more options, right? You have more options
absolutely.
That's there. But sir,
let me tell you, you asked a very good question and I'll just list a couple of things. Number one, foreign investment was strictly controlled.
Okay.
So in the sense that, and generally not given. Okay. So today, if you're a young Indian and you want to get into a certain area and you find that abroad there is this technology and you find a foreign partner who says, listen, why don't we do a joint venture and, I'll bring the technology and you can expand. Today, you can do that. In those days, the foreign investment would not be allowed. Point number one. Point number two. Technology. If you don't want investment, but you want to buy technology, in those days, you needed permission. Okay. So today, even if you're 100% Indian unit, I mean, in those days, if you were 100% Indian owned unit, you could be stopped from getting technology because some government fellow would say, "Arey sahab, ye to technology hamare paas hai. तो क्या जरूरत है नई टेक्नोलॉजी की?" Now, there's technology
Can't
and there's
even imagine
technology.
that.
I mean, look, today, for example, there's a lot of debate going on about restricting the import of, say, photovoltaic cells because we want to become self-sufficient. Now, there's a critical issue here. I mean, it's a good idea that we should develop a photovoltaic cell industry because we are going to be a major user of photovoltaic cells. But at the same time, we shouldn't just develop an Indian industry of low technology. Today, the conversion efficiency of our solar cells, the ones produced in India, I'm told are between 19 and 21%. Foreign cells available are 23 to 24%. And people tell me that the science is such that they expect this to go to 33%. Now, how do you promote Indian industry and at the same time make sure that they keep pace with what is happening abroad? You do that by allowing the user to import if he can, but you put a duty. Now, that's very different from putting a licensing restriction. Because a license, Raj, means that the duty is equivalent to 120% because the other fellow just can't get it. I remember when I was in commerce in the 1980s, I mean finance, but I was part of a committee which used to decide on licensing. Okay? And there was a guy, a small-scale industry guy who produced electric irons. So he said that I want to import this kind of iron sheet because it's a certain thinness and I need that for a proper electric iron. In the committee meeting, the DGTD, an unbelievably horrible organization called the Directorate General of Technical Development, which fortunately we abolished in 1991. They said, "Bhai, koi zarurat nahi import ki. Steel sheet to India mein bhi milti hai." But what this guy said is the steel sheets in India are much thicker and the iron will be much heavier. And I will never be able to produce an export quality iron. So these guys said, that's okay, you develop this and when you're ready to export, you can apply for thinner sheets and then because it's export, we'll give it to you. Now, you know, if a fellow is producing a particular product and he wants to produce another 2,000 irons for export, you can't apply for a different sheet for those 2,000 irons. As a result, you produce a firm where if somebody comes to look at the irons you produce, you just won't be taken seriously.
And sir, yehi one of the main reasons why entrepreneurship India mein nahi thi, because you know back in the day in my father's generation we used to say that ya to ab government job kar lo, you know, that is much more sorted. Because there was license Raj, because there was so much instability, right? Because young ideas and entrepreneurs could not prosper at that time.
In the sense, small scale industries themselves may not have been licensed. But to set up a small scale industry, you had to accept no technology, very small scale of production, very little access to capital, and all the state level getting permission, electric
can't
connection.
Even think of that. No? Today with private equity, venture capitalists, funding startups, you can't even think of it.
Absolutely correct.
Sir, 91... this is on how closed India was, right?
Yes.
The second part, can you just explain?
I'll tell you one other. Let me interrupt. Another example. Now this goes back before 1991 to when Rajiv Gandhi was Prime Minister. No, Rajiv was very convinced of the importance of telecom. Because he actually, and he said this, that there's a wrong notion in India that telecom is for the rich. And that's because we made it scarce and expensive. Telecom really should be for the poor because they're the ones who need to be able to call up a doctor because the doctor is far away, etc., etc. So we must do something on telecom. He also recognized that international connectivity is important for software development. And he had visited Houston in 85. I was part of his team of officials who accompanied him all over. And in Houston, Hewlett-Packard, I forget now whether it was Hewlett-Packard or Texas Instruments, one of these guys, said that, look, we want to set up a unit in Bangalore which will seamlessly work with our unit in Texas.
This is before 91.
Oh, it was in 85.
85, okay.
And it will, work that's being done during the day in Houston will be continued during Houston's night
Hmm.
because it'll be a day in Bangalore. And then when this lot finish, the other lot will come back and it'll be seamless. Okay. But for that, we need satellite communication. Okay. So Rajiv said, very important, you come, invest, etc. Then it turned out that the Department of Telecom did not have the technical capacity in those days to manage a satellite connection. So these fellows said that, look, don't worry, we will hire the satellite. So that's not a problem. And we will put the uplinking equipment, we'll bring our own. So that's not a problem. Then the department said, no, but telecommunications is a public sector monopoly. So we cannot let these fellows run their own uplinking system connecting with their own satellite. And Rajiv was furious and he said, look, get it done. So we found a complicated way of getting it done. They leased this equipment to the Department of Telecommunication. And the Department of Telecommunication was allowed to put a guy at the top who actually didn't understand anything about the equipment. The actual functioning of the equipment was all done by them. But technically, it became the DOPT or DOT setting up running a satellite on the basis of leased equipment and thus allowing connectivity.
Right.
The entire software revolution in India happened after that. It was the success of that venture that led to the development of software. So it gives you an example, A, of how close we were, B, that a strategic decision to overrule lower level officials and get things done made a difference.
Sure.
If the Prime Minister had not given this instruction, this would never have happened because the ministry just opposed it on legal grounds.
Yeah.
We can't let them, it's against the law.
कर नहीं सकते.
You know? So, I mean, I can give you, if you're interested or if you tell your readers, just read Backstage.
Sure. We'll put the link of the book also.
Yes, it's available in hopefully in bookstores, but certainly in Amazon.
Sure.
And I think there are 2 or 3 chapters there that deal with the pre-crisis situation.
Definitely.
And I personally think they should be made required reading for any young person.
Sure.
Because people tend to take this for example. My other point is that I hope that nobody restores this sign of control. Now, unless people realize the damage it does. But I'm encouraged by the fact that today's newspaper says that the MSMEs are opposing the rise in steel duties because they say it'll hurt them. And I mean, there are times when you have to raise duties, but it shouldn't be done mindlessly in the belief that it's always helping India.
Right.
It's helping some guys in India at the expense of other guys in India. The usual tendency is to think that as long as it's the consumer who's complaining, it doesn't matter. Because it's assumed that the consumer is some rich fellow. How does it matter if he's getting a lousy car? Okay? But the fact is it matters because the automobile industry then cannot appeal to consumers abroad because its own consumers don't want its product. But when it begins to hurt industry itself, that becomes a real issue. So raising duties on intermediate products, whether it's plastic or petrochemical fibers or steel, cement. Cement is not the same category. Copper, etc. You're hurting other Indian producers. And that issue is now reasonably well understood.
Okay. So, Hamne sir, we've understood how closed India was. Can you also explain 91, of course, Narasimha Rao appoints Manmohan Singh. India के अकाउंट में पैसा कितना था? कितना बुरा हाल था इंडिया का economically, financially?
Terrible, because I was Commerce Secretary at the time.
Can you give some figures? कि कितना बुरा
I
हाल
can't
था?
give you figures, but that you get out of Backstage.
ठीक है, we'll get that.
The fact is, we had our total reserves were worth about 2 weeks of imports.
Okay. So, मतलब, can we say that in very layman भाषा की सिर्फ 2 हफ्तों का पैसा था इंडिया के पास?
2 हफ्तों का import करने के लिए
import करने के लिए पैसा था. Entire economy was on import.
Normal level होता है 3 महीने.
3 महीने.
So instead of 3 महीने,
we were 2 weeks.
And secondly, many of these reserves at the rock bottom, they're not entirely liquid. I mean, for example, you may have kept your reserves, let's say in 3-year US treasuries. So when the reserves start running down, you get rid of the most liquid parts. By the time it gets down to a lower level, the reserves are less liquid. So getting rid of them also involves a cost. the situation was one where exporters would say, in those days, in order to export, you had to get an import license and you had to get permission to import. Exporters would say that, look, I'm going to export $100 million in the next 3 months, but for that I need imports of $30 million.
Sure.
But Reserve Bank is not clearing. Because the Reserve Bank also tried to limit how many clearances it gave because there just weren't reserves.
So,
and exporters would say, we're just killing ourselves.
yeah. So 2 weeks of import करने के लिए पैसा था हमारे पास.
That's how bad. And that's why the previous government, Yashwant Sinha, who was the finance minister, they had taken the decision that, look, we must borrow. Nobody was willing to lend to India because the general feeling was that you will not put in place the kind of economic policies that will create credibility. So what he said was, we have a lot of gold. So why don't we borrow on the strength of the gold? And they approached the Bank of England. Okay, $300 million of gold or something like that. We have more than that, but we want to borrow against the assurance of $300 million of gold from our reserves. The Bank of England said, yes, you can do that, but we will only accept that assurance if you shift the gold to London. In other words, they're not even willing to trust you that you will keep the gold available in case you can't repay the loan. They said, we'll only do that if you shift the gold to London. And under the previous government, I mean, they had decided to do that. Then the government fell. And I think it's to Manmohan Singh's credit that, I mean, of course, everybody was saying, "Arey, sona, desh ka sona bech diya, family jewels, ye wo, etc." But Manmohan Singh said, look, we must save the economy. This needs to be done. This was the right decision that Yashwant Sinha took. We are going to implement it. And they actually shifted that gold. It's all described in my book, Backstage. We had a fantastic experience where the Reserve Bank security people had an armored vehicle. An Air India plane was chartered, waiting in Santa Cruz. The gold was taken from the vaults of the Reserve Bank of India in Bombay, loaded into these security vehicles with escorts, etc. And Rangarajan, who was the deputy governor, and he's also written about this, Rangarajan was following the movement of this thing. In those days, there were no mobiles. So he was using a wireless. Everything all right? Have you reached Nariman Point? Have you reached Marine Drive? And on Marine Drive, the car broke down. The security car broke down. So they had to repair it a little while, and then the gold went out. So, I mean, it's a world which you can't even imagine now.
Right.
And there were lots of, these were tough decisions to take at the time. And Manmohan Singh did not try to blame the previous government. Although in the political field, very often people said, they're talking about this. He actually said this was the right thing to do, and I'm now going to do it. Which, I mean, the implementation of the thing was done under Manmohan Singh's finance ministership.
And how long it took to open the economy, like the reforms?
No, that's a good question. It took a hell of a long time because, we were so close that we needed to liberalize trade. We needed to liberalize industrial policy. We needed to liberalize foreign investment. We needed to liberalize technology. We needed to liberalize the capital market. And that's only part of, many other things. So it took several years, and some of these things were not even done until maybe 2001. For example, it was very clear that reservation of small-scale industries was a wrong thing. But politically, the government did not want to take on the criticism which would have come. I mean, they were criticized by the Swadeshi Jagran Manch, etc., that you're opening up the economy. So they said, look, let's not touch small-scale industries. Now, frankly, I think we should have touched small-scale industries. And out of the small-scale industries, if 100 of them, the 10 that were really good would have expanded 20-fold. True, the 90 that were not so good would have been crushed out. But their workers would have all been employed in the expanding better industries. But we didn't change that except very, very gradually. I think we had about 800 items that were reserved. for production. And this disappeared only during the Vajpayee regime in the 2000s. So basically, it took a full 10, 11 years.
Yeah. But what were the early signs, sir, when you say that there were only 2 weeks of money left to import, right? And the entire economy, was importing, right? Your energy needs, your oil needs. So 2 weeks you have import left. But what were the early signs when Dr. Manmohan Singh did that, opened the economy, that now we have some money to...
Well,
import?
I think we were clearly, because we negotiated an agreement with the IMF and the World Bank, that listen, we are doing a major reform. You please look at this and you should lend us money. That's what you're there for. I think people wrongly, and this is a very important point, people wrongly think that the reforms were pushed by the IMF and the World Bank. The IMF and World Bank view was that, look, you guys are over-controlled. Your own people are saying that you're over-controlled. I had written a note for VP Singh in 1980, I think. In 1990, which later on leaked and was called the M document. Because it didn't have an author's name, but everybody knew that I'd written it, which recommended a whole range of reforms. I mean, VP Singh wasn't able to do it, but he circulated the note for discussion in the cabinet secretariat. It leaked in the press. There was a huge discussion. Some people supported, other people opposed. So the World Bank and IMF knew that there's an internal debate going on, okay? And if we had not done these things, they would not have been able to lend. But actually, we did much more than what they were hoping for. They were hoping for a couple of things, devaluation, maybe some liberalization here. We went much beyond that. But as a result, it took a long time. And whenever you do something, there are always consequences. And when the consequences come up, people blame the policy. I mean, a good example is the Harshad Mehta scam. It
92.
92.
Yeah.
The root cause of the Harshad Mehta scam, in my view, was the excessive control over interest rates, which pushed a lot of people to find different ways of getting away from normal lending and using. When the Harshad Mehta scam broke, there was a joint parliamentary committee. This is also a detailed account given in my book. And there were people in the Joint Parliamentary Committee saying that this scam is because of liberalization. And I made the point it's not. It's because we didn't liberalize. It's because we didn't liberalize that people found roundabout ways of doing what should have been done by a straight market transaction. And it is liberalization that will prevent this scam from happening again. We were very lucky, by the way, that the committee did not recommend a rolling back of liberalization. Had it done so, I don't think Narasimha Rao would have had the courage to withstand that pressure. So it's to the credit of all the guys.
But I think all the 90s kids want to thank you and your entire team that led that liberalization, because we were always, कुछ भी चीज बाहर से मंगानी है तो हमने जो US और UK के cousins को बोलते थे. And now we don't have to, do
when
that,
I used to
everything
go,
is available.
Every time I would go abroad, my kids would say, ye chocolate le aao, ye. I mean, I used to go to Hamleys in goddamn Regent Street to get toys for my kids. Now I can go to Khan Market and Hamleys is there. And it's actually owned by Reliance.
India.
So,
absolutely.
People need to know that route is a disastrous route, and we just should not allow the country to go down that route.
Sir, one of the very important points, and I'll come to the time that you spend as the Deputy Chairman for the Planning Commission, I want to speak about a very controversial topic, which is growth, right? Now, when we talk about growth of a country, GDP of a country, can we say GDP is kind of a measure of the turnover of a country? Can we say that, right?
It's a measure of the net production.
Net production,
when I say net production, I mean, if one company produces a ton of steel,
right,
and another company buys that ton of steel for, say, 1,000 rupees and adds 400 value and sells its product at 1,400. Then the total turnover is 1,000 plus 1,400. But the value addition is only 400
yeah.
plus whatever the value addition is by the steel company itself. Because if the steel company is buying 800 rupees worth of iron ore
Okay.
and some electricity, it's adding only 200. So GDP is the value added in all stages of production.
Yeah.
So in that sense, it's the national production,
Correct.
not gross turnover, national production or national income.
Why I say controversial? Because, GDP growth, aapne ek, you said a quote recently that there are lies, there are more lies, and then there is statistics, right? And, in 1991, just to give context, right, we were about $270 billion in terms of the entire GDP. And today in 2020, we were about $3 trillion, right? So if we just have to, the impact 91 happened, right? We often forget it, हम भूल जाते हैं चीजें, but the impact, right, from a $260 billion to now $3 trillion, and we're talking about $7 trillion, $10 trillion in the next 5-7 years. We'll come to that. But so, मैं क्यों controversial बोल रहा हूँ कि सर actual GDP growth कितनी है? कोई बोलता है 6% है, कोई बोलता है 7% है, and from that I want to come to a very, very important point. Actual कितनी growth है? Today I was reading that, the IMF saying that India is at 7%, some say it as 6%. So, sir, firstly, can you just explain again कि GDP है क्या? एक तो बहुत सिंपल कि अगर कोई 15-16 साल का बच्चा अगर जो यंग इंडियन है, जीडीपी क्या है, एंड एक्चुअल ग्रोथ कौन से फिनोमेना से निकालते हैं, और एक्चुअल इंडिया में ग्रो हो कितना रहा है?
देखिए, जीडीपी तो अगर समझानी है जीडीपी है मतलब जो उत्पादन होता है, लेकिन उसमें जो आप दूसरों से खरीद के डालते हो उसको रिमूव करना चाहिए। मतलब अगर आप 100 रुपए का मटेरियल खरीद रहे हो और किसी चीज को प्रोड्यूस कर रहे हो और उसको बेच रहे हो 200 रुपए के लिए, तो ये आपने कितना प्रोड्यूस किया? आपने 200 प्रोड्यूस किया कि 200 माइनस 100, दैट लैटर। सो 100 इज वैल्यू एडेड। अब जो भी काम कर रहा है, किसान हो या सर्विसेज में हो या प्रोडक्शन मैन्युफैक्चरिंग हो, इनके लिए ये कैलकुलेशन कर सकते हैं कि भाई तुमने प्रोड्यूस किया कितनी वैल्यू और दूसरों से जो खरीदा वो कितनी वैल्यू, ये इन बिटवीन है वैल्यू एडेड। जीडीपी सम टोटल ऑफ वैल्यू एडेड। देश में कितनी वैल्यू एडेड हो रही है,
ऑल प्राइवेट पब्लिक
एवरीथिंग, ओके, एग्रीकल्चर, मैन्युफैक्चरिंग। तो इट इज, यू माइट से कि इतनी इनकम जनरेट हुई है और वो किस सेक्टर में हुई है, किसको मिली है, ये डिसाइड करना पड़ता है। अच्छा, नाउ क्वेश्चन इज कि जीडीपी ग्रोथ है क्या? अब इसमें इंडिया में थोड़ी कंट्रोवर्सी आई है क्योंकि हर एक कंट्री में जीडीपी को मेजर करने के लिए सर्वेज यूज करते हैं।
Sure.
Everything is not measured in
it's a
total.
survey.
And there is a view that our surveying system and data system measures the modern economy reasonably well.
Okay.
But the informal sector is not directly modeled.
Sure.
Okay?
Sure.
So there is a usual argument कि भाई उनके लिए कुछ assumption लगा देते हैं।
Okay.
So अगर समझ लो कि जो informal sector है वो 30% of the value है मैन्युफैक्चरिंग में, ठीक है, 30% है, लेकिन वो मेजर नहीं हो रहा। लेकिन जो मॉडर्न सेक्टर है वो समझ लो 70% है, लेकिन वो हर महीने या एटलीस्ट हर क्वार्टर मॉनिटर हो रहा है, तो दे आर रजिस्टर्ड कंपनीज, उनकी अकाउंट्स होते हैं, एटसेट्रा। सो जो स्टैटिस्टिकल सिस्टम्स हैं वो अस्यूम करते हैं कि भाई इन द प्रीवियस पीरियड जब मॉडर्न सेक्टर लेट अस से X% ग्रो किया था, तो इनफॉर्मल सेक्टर शायद X से थोड़ा ज्यादा या X से थोड़ा कम ग्रो किया।
But that's an assumption, right?
That's an assumption. तो फॉर लुकिंग अहेड आप मॉडर्न सेक्टर को मेजर करो और जो इनफॉर्मल सेक्टर है उसको अस्यूम करो कि जैसे पहले ग्रो कर रहा था वो उसी रेट पे ग्रो कर रहा है। जो हमारे मेजर्ड स्टेटिस्टिक्स हैं, जो 7% आपने कहा, वो हैं इस टाइप के। अच्छा, अब देयर इसमें 2 क्वालिफिकेशंस। एक तो 7% इज प्रीटी गुड, और पूरे दुनिया में पहले चाइना हमारे से मच फास्टर था। अब पिछले 3-4 साल चाइना स्लो डाउन हो गया। exact numbers I don't know, but China, most people think around 5% and slowing.
Post-COVID. Yeah.
Well, it may have been slowing even before COVID. Because after all, they've grown for 30 years at 10%.
Yeah.
So at some point, they were going to slow down.
Sure.
Now, in our case, as in the rest of the world, we were growing reasonably well, but COVID hit us badly, and COVID led to negative growth.
Mm-hmm.
So, उस negative growth में recovery होती है 1 साल, 2 साल, 3 साल, okay? अब अगर आप हमारे statistics देखो, तो अगर पिछले 3 साल ऑफिशियल स्टैटिस्टिक्स पिछले 3 साल की एवरेज लो, तो आपको लगेगा कि इकोनॉमी ग्रो कर रही है एट अबाउट ऑलमोस्ट 8%. ओके, पर अगर 6 साल के लो, देन इट्स 5%. Because the 8% includes, there was a big decline during COVID and then a big increase.
Bounce back. Correct.
So if you start from here, it looks high.
Okay.
If you count the decline, it looks low. How much is it really? Now, a lot of the people who question the 7%, they feel that we are not allowing for the fact that the process of modernization and formalization, which has been brought about by the introduction of the GST, etc., has meant that many companies are now formalizing, which is good.
Okay.
I mean, that was the original idea, that if you do GST, tax avoidance will go down, people will want to comply,
in the formal sector. Yeah.
Now, so therefore, the growth that is being counted in the formal sector includes the growth of those that are now entering the formal sector who were earlier in the informal sector.
Okay.
But by the same token, the informal sector is not going to grow the way it was growing earlier.
Correct.
So nobody knows what this adjustment is.
That assumption that used to
assumption.
Okay.
People like Arvind Subramaniam, and he was the chief economic advisor under this government from whatever 2015 onwards for about 3 years.
Yeah.
He says that the Indian growth is overstated by almost 2 percentage points.
He went on record to say that. Yeah.
But you know, my good friend Surjit Bhalla, who is also an economist, he says this is wrong and is not overstated. Okay. So I think whether the growth rate is overstated or not overstated is not something I would pronounce on. I think the process of formalization and what it will do to measurement should be a subject of more thinking and research, and we should be working on that. But you have to keep in mind that the bounce back is giving an exaggerated picture of growth, and the question is, what will it settle down to? Of the international convention, international agreement today seems to be, if we remain fiscally responsible, and we keep doing the reforms that we are talking about, then we can grow at 6.5%. Maybe with a bit of luck, 7%. Now, against this, you have Viksit Bharat assumptions. Some people say, Niti Aayog recently put out a document. And they said that for Viksit Bharat, between 7 and 10% growth is what you need. So the lower level of the Niti Aayog projection, you could say is deemed to be feasible if we keep doing reforms. The fact that we are growing at 7% now should not be taken as a proof that we are going to grow at 7%.
But sir, I have a very important question here. Why GDP growth actual estimate is important? Because, people still don't understand that there is an entire stock market, there is a, fake money also, right? There is an invisible money also. They correlate with the real economic growth, right? So because there is if you see the last 18 months, the last 24 months, how the stock market, the financial markets have happened, right? A lot of retail investors, a lot of people, right? वो कंफ्यूज करते हैं कि जो एक्चुअल इंडिया ग्रो कर रहा है, लेट्स से 7-8% पे ग्रो कर रहा है, जो नंबर आया विद द मार्केट्स ग्रोथ, राइट, कि वो मार्केट में पैसा लगा रहे हैं. सो एज अ रिजल्ट व्हाट आई एम वरीड इज दैट because of these data, exact data is very important to understand, because 99% people, in my view, they put in money in the capital markets or in the share markets considering कि इंडिया इतना ग्रो कर रहा है. So that is very, very important, because there is no correlation, right? There is no correlation between the stock market increase and the real economic growth.
Yes.
So,
look, I usually don't like commenting on the stock market, because I don't want to influence anybody. Ke bhai jao ke na jao. That
Okay.
is, in fact,
Okay.
every stock market investing advisor is meant to tell you
Okay.
that stock market investments include risk.
Okay.
So you please make up your mind what the risk is
Sure.
and how much risk you're willing to take.
Okay.
But there's no doubt that the ratio, the sharp rise in the capital market does not reflect the growth rate in this period. Now, some people might say that the sharp rise reflect the expectation
जो होने
that
वाला है.
growth is even going to go higher.
नहीं, but sir, India के brand image, sir, like this is like I have seen that, right? What India was 2004 to 14, right? To 2014 to now, the image of India has increased phenomenally, right? When you talk about India as a brand, that has increased. So, are you referring to maybe the increase that people are expecting कि इतना grow जब होगा, let's say जो 7 to 10% है, जब होगा तो then people will also make money?
No, look, comparing 2004 to 2014 and 2014 to today, two things need to be kept in mind. Number one, the growth rate, average growth rate of the economy in 2004 to 14 was about 7.6%.
Sure. Yeah.
The average growth rate from 2014 to today is about 5.7%. These are official
Considering
statistics.
COVID का भी अगर हम
Yes,
कर
so
लें,
that's the argument that let's say those who want to argue that this doesn't prove that the UPA was doing a good job, they would say two things. One, during that period, the world economy was also growing faster, which is true.
Yeah.
And of course, they also had the global financial crisis
2007-8.
Then you had COVID, which was really a shock to everybody.
Yeah.
So you can't compare those two growth rates. That's fine. I mean, I'm willing to buy that story. Look at the capital market. The percentage growth of market capitalization between 2004 and 2014 is greater than between 2014 and today. Percentage increase in market capitalization is actually greater. Okay. The difference is that was a more steady thing. And in the later years, it had tailed off a bit.
Sure.
Okay. Today, the growth of the capital thing is a last 3-4 year phenomenon. Okay. It may reflect the fact that people believe that we are really now determined to do a lot of reforms and are going to move ahead.
The future growth also.
It may reflect the fact that there's been global liquidity in this period.
Okay. Yeah.
So a lot of foreign funds have come in.
Yeah.
Not in the last 2 years, but during this period, that has jacked up the capital market. It could also reflect the fact, this is very important, that unlike in the earlier period, ordinary people were not starting to invest in mutual funds.
Sure.
The reason they're doing that now more is that bank deposit rates are not attractive.
Sure.
And people have learned that there is this other thing available. So lots and lots of middle class Indians are putting their savings into the stock market through mutual funds.
Sure.
Okay?
Sure.
And that has led to this big rise.
And digital infrastructure भी तो बहुत ज़्यादा increase हो गया ना सर. मतलब the digital infrastructure when we call
you
that.
can now do
ease,
it on your cell
that
phone,
is also
mobile.
the ease is also.
Yes, 100% correct.
So sir, one thing.
But what I'm trying to say is, as a result, that I would, in no country, do they regard market capitalization change as a measure of actual growth.
Yeah, that's what the point.
They do regard it as a change of expectation.
Sure.
So certainly, if you believe that in the next 18 months, we are going to introduce 8 of the 10 reforms that are needed, this will be fully justified.
Definitely.
But if you don't...
But there's no correlation. That's what I wanted to understand from an economics angle.
There's no correlation between
market capitalization.
Actual growth in a period and the rise in market cap in that period.
So actual growth of a country and market capitalization in the capital market.
Let me step back. If a country is not doing well, you won't get the capitalization. Because nobody would believe we are not doing well, but we are going to do well.
Fair enough.
I think what has happened internationally, this is an important thing. See, for a long time, even during the UPA period, India did better than other emerging markets other than China. Okay. We didn't talk very much about it. That's not Dr.Manmohan Singh's style anyway. So it was, whatever it was there. But I think what has changed is that in those days, people were terribly enthused about China. And compared
Sure.
to China,
Sure.
we were nowhere.
Okay.
Okay. That has changed from about the last 3 or 4 years onwards. That for geopolitical reasons,
Yeah.
both America and Europe
Hmm.
have become negative on China.
Sure. Sure.
And that is dominantly because China is challenging these guys.
Yeah.
The Chinese are more or less, I mean, look, when before Xi Jinping,
Yeah.
China was low profile. They were doing their growth, but not challenging.
Yeah.
Last 5 years, Xi Jinping has made it plain.
Yeah.
And we're going to challenge you militarily.
Yeah.
We're going to challenge you economically.
Yeah.
And we're going to challenge you in system-wise.
Yeah.
Because we want to tell the world that your system, democracy, liberty, and all this is all nonsense.
Yeah.
And that we are the way to go.
Sure.
Now, faced with this challenge, the US and Europe, understandably, feel that, look, they need to react against this in some manner. Okay. So the global perception now is, and also China has slowed down. Okay. So the global perception now is not to talk too much about China
Okay.
and say, look, who could be the substitutes?
India.
And India looks good.
Okay.
India wants to be a substitute.
Okay.
And India is positioning itself, telling the West that,
Okay.
look, we can work together.
Okay.
And not just in economics. Actually, in economics, we haven't done very much.
Fair.
But in what you would call the security side. So the fact that our government is moving to a more workable relationship on the security side is creating a positive vibe about India.
So
This will have to be supported by continuing growth. And that's the crux of the issue. I mean, I share the view that India is now well positioned to achieve 7, maybe a little bit over 7
okay.
on a consistent basis.
But you don't feel it's 7 right now? It's
Well, when you say right now, I mean, the data has just come out for last year.
Yeah.
My suspicion is that it will be less than 7 in the coming, in the year 24-25.
25, FY25.
Yeah, most people think that it'd be around 6.5.
Okay.
Some people have revised the estimate higher.
Okay. World Bank said, IMF said 2 days back 7%.
They're looking at what the government of India
Sure.
itself is saying.
Sure.
And generally,
Sure.
these organizations
Sure.
are not going to question.
Yeah.
I'm not sure, by the way, whether the IMF, I think they were talking about 24-25.
FY25, the projected growth.
Yeah,
they've put it to
so
7%.
that's what our chaps are saying. So
Yeah.
I'm saying it's possible.
So last question on the GDP and the growth of India. So the targets of 2030, 7.3 trillion and then 10 trillion by 2035. Niti Aayog, as you mentioned 7 to 10%. So do you feel that like 7 to 10% would make us reach the $10 trillion GDP mark in the next 10 years?
My suspicion is that it depends on what you call Viksit Bharat.
Okay.
If you're calling Viksit Bharat gross national personal income of about $14,000, my guess is you need well above 8%.
Okay.
Okay.
To reach $10 trillion.
I don't know about this.
Okay.
I don't actually like the focus on 10 trillion.
Why don't you like that?
Because, you can, I'll be dead before we reach those
like
points.
that.
It's much better to say, okay, boss, what is the growth rate you're aiming at? Because I
That's
know
interesting.
what the growth
That's
rate is
interesting.
going to be every quarter.
Okay.
So if you say over the next 10 years, I'm going to grow at 7, let's say 7%.
Okay.
And in quarter by quarter, you are between 6.8 and 7 and so on. I would say you're on track.
Sure.
If on the other hand, quarter by quarter, you become 6.8, 6.5, 6.4, you could say, well, you're not on track. But this 10 trillion 5 years from now, I mean, you never know whether you're on track.
Yeah.
So I personally do not like these targets of 10 years from now.
Okay.
It's much better to translate that into growth. There's another reason for that. The other reason is that, we are now entering the middle of the, what you might call middle income range. Okay. And there is a view based on past experience that it becomes more difficult to grow when you reach the middle of the middle income range. Because growth depends on multiple things, multiple institutions working well, and people perceiving that they work well. Okay? I mean, you're seeing all this controversy about SEBI. It's very important that people should believe that our capital market is well regulated.
Yeah.
I don't want to comment on the specific issues,
Okay.
but it tells you that if your concern is people's perceptions, then it becomes important to manage those. And this is not a reform. I mean, there's no one thing you can do that will affect perceptions. People perceive based on all kinds of things. People perceive, for example, if you're going to invest a lot of money in India, people want to know how long does it take to resolve a dispute. And I mean, if you ask any lawyer and you say, I'm going to invest X billion dollars into India, will there be, if there's a dispute, how long will it take? And the lawyer will tell you 20 years. Now, for these big investments, they assume that, look, we're in touch with the government. There won't be a problem. If there's a problem with some contractor, TK, that can take as long as it's done. Yeah. But if you're a middle-level investor who wants to invest $20 million, and then you're told that if there's a problem, it could take 20 years, I mean, you would think twice.
But perception to matter करती है ना sir, मतलब in terms of growth it matters ना.
At the same time, these reforms are more difficult. Sure. Because it's not as if the government is saying it should take 20 years. In fact, the government is constantly saying we should improve this. Even the Chief Justice of India is saying we should improve it. But it will only improve over time, and then that will be reflected in people's perception. Look, when we opened the economy in 1991, in the very next year, we opened up for portfolio investment. Very controversial at that time. And again, I refer you to Backstage to get a sense of the controversies. We were aware that it will take a long time for portfolio investments to come. But you know, about 10, 12 years later, portfolio investments flooded in. And this flooding of portfolio investments helped Indian industry. Because with the rise in value of capital issues, they were able to mobilize money for themselves. Okay. So many of these institutional changes take a long time to develop. Then new challenges arise. I mean, this is happening in the United States. In the United States, for example, today, the telecom regulator is launching major attacks on the tech companies. Saying that they are dominating the market in a manner that is stifling competition. Sure. So, you know,
I'll come to the
people look to judge whether you're ready to leave the low income category.
Sure.
You require some obvious reforms. To judge whether you keep going during the middle income category, you need more sophisticated reforms. Take a simple example. One thing is very clear that, you know, market capitalization moves up and down. I mean, if you look at our own Sensex, it shoots up, shoots down. So these variations are normal. And I wouldn't recommend to people when something is overvalued or not overvalued, but just let them look at a graph. If you go back from 2004 to the present, you will see that there were ups and downs. And so unless you believe that everything that went on for the last 20 years in two different governments is not going to happen now, and that it's going to stay at a certain level, that's one view. The other view is there will be ups and downs. You have to decide when you're ready for a down and make your own decision. I want to just add a little example. You know, the best way of emphasizing the impact of, if you like, froth in the market is that, you know, when the market goes up, a lot of people who normally don't invest in the market feel that this and other fellows are benefiting a lot, so let me also go into the market. There's a very nice story, I think it's J.P. Morgan, famous financier who actually managed to escape the 1929 crash. And somebody asked him, how could you escape the 1929 crash of the stock market? And he said, you know, I was having my shoes polished. And the guy who was polishing my shoes, he said to me, Mr. Morgan, what do you think about these particular stocks? Because I'm thinking of investing in them. And he said, when I found that chaps who polish shoes are starting to invest in stocks, I felt the market must be overhyped. And I got out. So this is a consequence of what they call excess enthusiasm. You see a market going up, people who don't invest get in. They usually get in when the market is a bit too high anyway. The guys who really were intelligent are the ones who bought when the market was down. But people then go up even more, well, the market goes up further. it corrects itself. There's a difference, however. You have to ask yourself, why are people enthusiastic? Well, in a particular period. One is, of course, some people, it's just momentum. I mean, they see the thing going up, they think it'll keep going. The other is they see the underlying growth of the economy. And if they feel that the underlying growth of the economy shows that the economy is doing well, which is why the market cap has gone up, then other people jump in and go up further. That higher cap can be sustainable if the economic growth also keeps increasing. But if it's not going to increase, even if it stabilizes at, say, 7%, there'll be some correction. So there is a relationship between market capitalization and current growth rate. And I would put it as follows. It's very unlikely that you will get capital markets shooting up when the current growth rate is shooting down. But when the current growth rate seems to be going up, you can get an excessive increase of that. That high capital market can be sustained only if growth and profit in future rises up even more. Now, that becomes a matter of judgment. Do you believe? If, for example, today you felt that we are on the cusp of becoming a 10% growth economy, then maybe the market cap that you've got is not so unreasonable. But if you think that we're really only 7% and that's going to continue, then maybe there'll be a correction. Of course, if the growth rate goes down, then there'll be an even bigger correction. And those are the uncertainties. I wouldn't pretend to persuade people one way or the other. That's why investing in the market is very difficult. And that's why you want to have a balanced portfolio as well as you can. So to summarize, the market capitalization is not independent of growth performance, but it is by no means a predictor of what will happen. It is to some extent a reflection of what people think will happen. But that can be driven by either, if you think it's only very knowledgeable people who are investing, or a hell of a lot of herd investors are coming. And when herd investors come in, you can't be sure that their judgment about the future is particularly low.
Inclusive growth is defined as the economic growth that is distributed fairly across the society to create opportunities. During your time at the Planning Commission, you were part of 2007-11. We wrote in the 11th plan. You wrote about faster, more inclusive India. And then the subsequent was faster, more inclusive and sustainable India.
Correct.
Sir, I want to touch base. One of the most sensitive topics, and I think you were the best person to talk about, is the inequality. While you were at the World Bank, you were the youngest divisional chair also, the inequality or the wealth distribution part of it. So, 11th plan, 12th plan talks about inclusive growth. Still, sir, when we talk about wealth and income numbers, 1% of India owns about 53% of country's wealth. Top 10 in the income, when we talk about income, 10% population and 1% population respectively hold 57 and 22% of total income respectively. So where are we headed? We're talking about GDP growth, we've talked about a great India. But sir, in terms of the inequality in India, whether it is income and wealth distribution, I think it is going even bad to worse. What's happening, sir?
It's both a very good and very difficult question, not just for India, but for all countries. I think you made a very valid point that in the 11th plan, we talked about faster and more inclusive growth. And then in the 12th plan, we said faster, more inclusive and sustainable.
Yes.
Okay. Now, both inclusiveness and sustainability are about distribution.
Yes.
In the sense that inclusiveness means that the growth must benefit everybody. Sustainability means that the growth should not be unfair to future generations. Really, the idea is that each generation should do a maximum it can. But the least it can do is to leave the next generation with the same natural resources that it had. Or if it uses up some of them, uses technology that makes those less necessary. Unsustainable growth is when you're sustaining present consumption at the risk of future consumption, which is happening. For example, if you pollute your rivers, you may be generating industrial production, but you're going to create a lot of ill health, and fish will die, and others will lose out. When you talk about climate change, this is an impact that will be just over 20 years. So between sustainability and inclusiveness are, if you like, different aspects of the same idea of the distribution concept. Who's getting the benefit of growth? Now, let me step back. This has always been a concern that GDP by itself isn't very meaningful unless you think it's being distributed properly. Because the purpose of economics is human happiness or social happiness and so on. And that depends on economics providing everybody benefits. Sure. The earliest reference in India, and it's a very good example, by the way, of how parliamentary discussions bring up issues of controversy. When one of the progressive members of parliament raised this issue, I forget his name, I forget the name, I'll come back. He questioned Pandit Nehru that, look, you're talking about growth, but what is the growth doing for the poor? Then he said, in China, the growth is going to the poor, but is it going to the poor in India? Because poverty is increasing. When he raised this issue, Panditji set up a committee, a very estimate karo ke poverty mein kya ho raha hai, and that led to that whole focus of the concern about poverty. And they started using the National Sample Survey to see if he could do something about it. And I think the Planning Commission was tasked. This is towards the end of Panditji's life. He had tasked the Planning Commission, okay, tell me, what is the growth we need? What is the growth strategy we need if we want to get rid of poverty in 15 years? Okay. And so I think it was in 1963. He died in 64. This task was given to the Planning Commission in 62. And they prepared a report called Perspective Plan for Development. And they came to the conclusion that, look, we are so poor that merely by redistributing what we have, we cannot get rid of poverty. Certainly we can help the poor and take away from the rich, but we are so poor that the total pie has to expand. Okay. Then they said that, look, if India can, at that time, by the way, India was growing at 5%. Okay. They said that if the total pie can expand at 7% per year, okay, everybody would be raised above the poverty line except the bottom 20%. Okay, so even then, 7% would leave the bottom 20%, if you like, not adequately helped. And therefore, the strategy was, let's get 7% growth, but let's do something special for the bottom 20%, but even 77% growth won't help. So the idea that you have growth and you have measures to help the poor will go on there. When I was in the World Bank, we wanted to focus on poverty. And Alice Chenery was then the vice president of the World Bank. And he brought together a team, I was one of them, which talked about how to build redistribution into the strategy of growth. And there the focus was that it's not that you just go for growth and look at who's missing out and do something to this. The kind of growth you have also makes a difference. And the big issue there was you should have a growth which helps agriculture. Because that's where most people in developing countries are. That's where the poor are. So it's not just the rate of growth, it's the composition of the growth. Some sectors, growth in some sectors is more helpful to distributions than growth in other sectors. But even after that, there'll be some people that remain poor. And he gave credit to the work of the Planning Commission. In this document produced by the World Bank in 1973, or redistributional growth, which became a very standard type of text to push the distribution idea. He acknowledged that the first quantitative effect in building the issue of distribution and poverty was the Indian Planning Commission in 1962. So that's one thing. By the time in our case, the whole focus was on poverty. Indira Gandhi sort of, ye kehte hai, Indira hatao, main kehti hu, Garibi hatao. That whole campaign was fought on the idea that we must reduce poverty. And this was not just India. That is what Bhutto was doing in Pakistan also. Roti, kapra or mita. So there the question was, look, we must make sure that growth helps the poor. And poverty in India those days was 60% by our official poverty line. And the whole focus was, can we bring it down? Okay. By the time the UPA came in 2004, I was back in Planning Commission. We were monitoring poverty, and there were many schemes that had been evolved. A, helping agriculture, and B, helping the poor. Now, clearly, the Green Revolution was the biggest thing that helped agriculture. But it's interesting that when the Green Revolution was introduced, the guys who cared about distribution were negative about the Green Revolution, because they said it only helped the big farmers. The truth is, it did help the big farmers. But when development takes place, you do what you can, and you assume that others will benefit in due course. But sometimes you also do damage, which is what the Green Revolution did. With excess use of fertilizer, excess use of water, made worse by bad policies. Because we subsidize fertilizer, we subsidize power. That's a separate issue. So I think we were talking about faster growing, losing growth. And in the 11th plan, we made a very specific statement that the target growth rate for agriculture should be 4% a year. And actually, we knew that 4% growth of agriculture may not be absorbed by the population given its demand, but India could become a supplier of agricultural exports. So there's a lot of burden. 4% was reasonable. We have never reached it so far. I mean, the best we were able to do is about 3.6. And I think in the current situation, it's also about the same. So we have not yet got to 4%. Separately, I mean, rightly, I think the focus has been on doubling farmers' income. We should focus on that. But of course, when you say doubling farmers' income, it cannot be that all the people who are farming will keep farming. You can double farmers' income if you can create enough non-agricultural demand for labor so that people currently dependent on agriculture move up. And they were, during the UPA period, the percentage of labor force in agriculture did decline. And it declined right up to 2011-12. More recently, it has gone up because of COVID. People have moved back. So that's not such a healthy phenomenon. But then, increasingly, distribution also became a multi-dimensional thing. It's not just income. So somebody would say that, look here, you've got a poverty line. So if I'm above this poverty line, but I don't have housing, which is not really dependent only on the market. I don't have good schooling, so my kids cannot get better jobs. I don't have good health, so my kids are undernourished. So, you need inclusiveness needs not just income to be distributed, but the provision of public goods, which will increase the ability of the population to benefit from growth by increasing their capability. So that's a multi-dimensional thing. And that led to the focus on multi-dimensional poverty, which is a new phenomenon. But let me finish. I was taking a bit too long. Please. Another view on distribution is it's not just households. What about male and female? There's a huge amount of distributional inequity amongst men and women. In traditional India, I mean, women eat after kids and men have been fed. And typically, the men are given preference, the boys are given preference, the girls get less food, and the woman of the household eats the last. That's a distributional issue. And many families which otherwise are affording consumer goods and not maybe giving enough to the female members of the household. Okay, so that's an issue, which is a distribution. Similar issue arises in the matter of caste, where, poverty may be going down for the population as a whole. But if all the poor are lower caste, then you've got an inter-caste differential, which is unequal. So you need to take care of that. The third dimension is regional. I mean, you may have a boom in Gujarat, in Maharashtra, in Telangana, in Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu. But if you don't have growth in Bihar and UP, then inequality across regions increases. And it's not good enough. You can't go into parliament and say, in my regime, poverty has declined, and that has mostly taken place in these states, but in these states it hasn't declined. So a regional dimension. Now, Rajiv Gandhi was very aware of this. The whole KBK districts of Orissa, the need to focus on special districts, which are especially poor, that came up and was purely regional concern. That has continued. I mean, in the UPA time and even the present government times, focus on backward districts have become important. And finally, of course, there's sustainability. Because I made the point in the 12th plan that whatever you look at, we've made progress. We haven't made as much progress as we would have liked. Maybe the most progress was in growth. There was progress in reducing poverty, but not as much as we would have wanted. There's progress in also improving access to education, but quality of education hasn't improved. Certainly, the totality of health as reflected in the expected life has gone up because people are living much longer. And people don't realize that at independence, the expectation of life was 35 years. It's now 70 something. But the point is the quality of this existence is not that great. So availability of health is poor, etc., etc. But you can still say that there's improvement. But one area where there is no improvement is sustainability. Quality of rivers deteriorated, quality of water deteriorated, quality of air deteriorated. I mean, 10 or 15 most polluted cities in the world are in India. And this can change. So I think once problems are identified, if you find sensible ways of addressing the problems, they can.
But then my understanding about it and why I covered after GDP, because a lot of people, as you rightly pointed out, they confuse the country is growing, the poor are also coming out of the poverty. A lot of people, while you were doing research, and we see that there is a trend also in developing countries, right? That the disparity between the rich and the poor keeps on increasing, right? It's not only in India, but we see around the world.
Yeah.
But so my point again is that as a country, and I feel that India is one of the most beautiful countries in terms of the diversity, right? You don't have it anywhere across the world, right? You go 200 miles north, east, west, south, you have different people, different food, different language, and that's the beauty of India. So what are the measures to be taken to take it out from how does, sir, this is shocking for me that 1% of the rich.
Let me comment on
yes, please.
You must separate out inequality in general from extreme concentration at the top.
Okay.
And this is now recognized even in the West. This focus on extreme concentration came in America after the global financial crisis.
Sure. Yeah.
Now, traditionally, our view was if you can get growth that is inclusive, that reduces poverty, that provides public goods, and it's broadly spread so that everybody is benefiting. If inequality is increasing in the process, don't worry too much. I mean, the idea is taking care of inequality is something that requires the development of systems and institutions that will take 20 and 30 years. Yeah. And I think that in India, we can probably say that poverty has certainly gone down. Intermediate segments of the population have also benefited. And this should not be underemphasized. upper income groups, yes, they've also benefited the most. But that's not the extreme concentration. The problem with extreme concentration is that those who have such high levels of wealth can actually influence the politics and effectively take control of the policy.
Yeah.
That is not what democracy is. So the concern is you need a system where the use of wealth to influence the democratic process is transparent and people can see whether those who have extreme wealth are exercising a disproportionate power. Now, those who are wealthy will exercise more power. But, a lot of the power can be used for good or used for ill. You need to be more aware of it, be more watchful about it, etc., etc. And on the data, I have not seen, there's in my view, no official data that actually tells you what is the percentage of income that the top 1% actually get. These are all assumptions made by academics, good or bad, I don't know. And very often the so-called wealth calculator is also a bit dubious. After all, when you say the total wealth of the country, okay, you can calculate what the market cap is.
Yeah, what do you mean by that? Correct.
No, but for example, does the wealth of the country include human capital? I mean, yes, these guys have a huge amount of, if you like, capital value. But if you count human capital as part of capital, are you including that in the total value of capital for the country? My guess is they're not. Then land is a very important part of wealth. Are they including all the land and valuing it correctly? I don't think so.
So when you say land is land distribution.
The top 1% don't own 50% of the land. Most of the land is owned by agricultural guys. They may not be very poor, but they may be in the 20, 30, 40% level. So when you calculate the wealth of the top as a percentage of total wealth, part of the problem here is that wealth is confused with income.
Yeah. But sir, if any three measures you want to recommend in terms of what do you feel that the disparity between the rich and the poor, right? Because again, I'll come to the point of growth versus, the distribution of wealth, right? For any three measures you feel that can reduce, because as you said, the poverty has come down.
That's clearly is very well known. Look, most important measure is taxation.
Okay.
Globally, people appreciate that taxation should be progressive. That is, the richer people should pay a higher proportion of their income as tax. And I think we also have a progressive tax system. You can do some research on which system is more progressive. I mean, for example, one view is that, there are too few people in India paying taxes. That's probably true.
Yeah.
There are a lot of people now reporting income because you have to report income even if you don't pay. Agricultural income is not taxed at all.
So one is the taxation, and what are the
One
other
is
two?
taxation. Is it sufficiently progressive?
Okay.
An issue that very often people raise is that should there not be inheritance tax?
Sure.
It's a legitimate point.
Yeah.
I mean, should you have no limit? Clearly, most people around the world put the inheritance tax only at a very high level of income. Okay. And there is another issue. Should the inheritance tax be on the basis of the total estate or on the amount inherited by each individual? I mean, let me give you a simple example. If you have an inheritance tax, let's say at 20%, then the estate gets taxed 20% of its value. But if that estate is distributed between 10 people,
Okay, 10 people.
and one fellow gets half of it,
उसका 20% होना चाहिए.
उसका तो होगा. But one person only gets 1/10 of it.
Yeah.
He's also being taxed 20%.
20%.
So another way is that, look, estate is not going to be taxed,
Yeah.
but what is bequeathed, the inheritance, is going to be taxed. That way, the tax would be progressive depending on what you inherit. One of the big issues there, and this is a very important thing in America, they allow a complete exemption if you put your estate into recognized charities. Many of the biggest charities in America are actually escaping their inheritance tax because people prefer to set up charitable foundations.
They're happening in India also. Trust, they make a trust and, you can.
Well, we don't have inheritance tax.
So anyway.
That issue doesn't arise. But if we do have an inheritance tax, would we allow an exemption, 100% exemption of whatever is donated to a charitable cause? That's an issue. That's a complex issue. Progressivity is not just a matter of taxation. It's a matter of how expenditure is distributed. I mean, you collect 15 or 16% of GDP. If you collect it all from the top 10%, but you spend it in a way that benefits the bottom 20%, two together have to be treated as whether they're progressive or not. If you take away 16% and your expenditure only benefits the top 10%, then in net terms it's not progressive at all. So the progressivity of a fiscal system has to be measured in terms of how much of the net transfer through the fiscal system. And this creates a lot of problems. For example, defense. Defense is spent out of taxation. What is the benefit of defense? Is it only the rich that are benefiting from defense? Or are the poor also benefiting? And are they benefiting proportionately? That's one issue. Infrastructure. You build a lot of infrastructure. Who's benefiting from the infrastructure? Generally, both the poor and the rich. So it's not easy to determine how progressive the fiscal system is. And I think net, if we take a comprehensive view, are the poor, is the standard of living of the poor improving? Is the improvement commensurate with the kind of growth that's taking place? Are the non-poor but non-rich also benefiting? That's also very important. And therefore, very soon, you will have at least 10 or 15 parameters to look at. And then your task will be, how do you make a composite picture out of these 10 or 15 parameters? And opinions get varied.
So a lot of people also say, yeah, this is Dubai ki tarah ko tax hi nahi hona chahiye.
No, that's your...
But can you explain that? Why is it rubbish?
Dubai manages to do this because the basic income of Dubai comes from oil. Okay? And if you are an oil-rich country, then whatever, and you have very few people in the country, then essentially what you're doing is you're financing the essential government expenditure out of oil. And the people, as opposed to those who own the oil, people are actually only receiving moderate levels of income. And you can have either very low tax or zero tax. If you're running a country like India with 1.4 billion people, it's completely nonsensical to say that income tax should be abolished. Some people would say that income tax ko abolish kar do, but GST laga do. That amounts to saying that GST ko double kar do. And widen the coverage. That they don't say. So, frankly, unless you want to abolish the government, you cannot abolish taxation because taxation pays for the government.
So, you talked about inequality. You talked about the women in the home. So, this is the data which is there. Out of 146 countries, India ranks at 127, 128 on the gender inequality. So, as an entrepreneur running a company myself, I am very worried on the women inequality is one part. Recently, what happened in Kolkata, a lot of people didn't know. We actually did a podcast recently with a lot of doctors. I didn't know that there are 15 lakh doctors in India and about 64% doctors in India are female. 80% of nurses in India are female. And, the woman, the lady doctor or nurses, if they are so crucial in the Indian medical system, the entire medical system can collapse, right? What is your take on missing women in workplaces? Because
it's quite clear that the missing women in workplaces is an indictment of our system. I mean, we need, on an equality basis, the labor force participation of men and women should be the same. The labor force remuneration for comparable standards should be the same. Now, if it's not the same, but it differs very slightly, you don't have to worry too much. But in our case, the differences are very wide. Now, the difference between salaries paid or salaries earned between men and women. That's a problem globally. I mean, everywhere, women are being paid less than they deserve. That's true for us also. On labor force participation, I tend to take the view that our female labor force participation rate is very low. It may be improving. It should be higher than it is. That's for sure. And let me say another thing. Security for women is not exactly an equality of income issue, but it's an equality in terms of essential public service. I mean, anybody has a right to life and safety. And that means that I should be able to go around anywhere, pursuing any legal profession in an environment. If somebody violates my right to do that, I expect that the law will prevent that from happening. What you've seen in crimes against women clearly suggests that we're not providing women anything like the level of safety.
क्या करना चाहिए? You as a policy expert, what?
No, clearly women's safety and the policing is very important. Look, most people wrongly think, and this many researchers have now established, it's wrongly thought the government is bloated, that it hires too many people. It is true that the government has too many peons and clerks, because with modern technology, digitalization, etc., this peon C and D category of workforce has to shrink. But A and B category may have to expand. We don't have enough doctors, we don't have enough nurses, we don't have enough policemen, we don't have enough judges. If you make any comparison between India, let's say Thailand and Indonesia, both are richer than us, but they're developing money. The number of policemen per million of the population, the number of doctors per million of the population, number of nurses per million of the population, number of judges per million of the population, we will be 1/3 of what we need. Now, if you don't provide these people, don't expect safety. And if you were to provide these people, you should recruit them. Most people have a 25-year working life. So if you say in the next 12 years, they're not going to hire any more peons, you're not going to hire any more clerks, you will reduce this number to 50% of what it is now. But we're going to hire guys who feel that, look, we lose government jobs. They should be reassured. We're going to hire 3 times as many people in these other things which we need. And that's what's not happening.
Sir, you mentioned about healthcare was mentioned, and I want to touch base healthcare for just a couple of minutes. What needs to drastically change in our healthcare system? Any 3 big ticket items?
One thing we have to recognize, healthcare is actually a state subject. So don't expect too many things from the central government. It is a state subject. I personally think, in order to improve healthcare, number one, the states must allocate more money to health. Okay. I don't think this should be done by the central government having a scheme to healthcare, because then the central government starts interfering with the design of the health state. I think the design of the healthcare should be left entirely to the state. I mean, if some state wants to muck it up, they should be free to muck it up. And politically, people should say, well, look, these guys have mucked it up. Let's change the government and bring in another government. If the state needs more money to do this, that should come through the Finance Commission as an untied ground. But that's one side of it. They need more money. But this is the biggest problem. All states will agree with what I've said. What they will not agree with is that the money should be devolved to the lower levels. It should be spent the way the municipalities and the Gram Panchayat want it to be spent. This also means that the jobs that are needed should be recruited at that level. We should, in my view, we should not have central recruiting or rather state level recruiting of teachers. This recruiting of teachers should be left to whoever is controlling a school. And that would help them. They would naturally give preference to locally available people. They would have better control over them. And you would avoid the present situation where, because government jobs are so attractive, people from state capitals apply for jobs, get posted in rural areas, and spend half their time trying to get back to the state capital. But this would require the state government at the state chief minister level devolving resources lower down and saying, you do it. Here's the money, hire a teacher.
Would you say the same thing about education also?
I would say the same thing. Let's put it this way. Education at the moment is a concurrent subject. If you define concurrent subject to me, that public school systems can be run entirely by states. I wouldn't like to say that the central government should not run schools. They are running some schools, let them run some schools. But the schools, what goes into the state school system, should be entirely under the control of the state government. That's point number one. Point number two is a large proportion of it should be devolved downwards. Now, let me make a point here. And that's real democracy. That's going down to the third level. The argument against that, which many people made, and I must say that when I was in government, I was persuaded by this argument. So I wasn't particularly pushing for this reform, but I think I was wrong. And I would push for it now. The feeling was that at the lower level, local caste and interest groups will dominate. That's true. But then that's what politics has to address. By substituting the local caste and interest levels by state level intervention, you don't stop the casteism. Because whichever castes are strong, they become strong at the state level also. I think if you want real democracy, you need to empower the lower levels. And there are many studies that have been done. In this regard, I recommend you the most recent book by Karthik Gundidhar, an 800-page tome on India's development. And he makes the point, and documents it, that the degree of devolution in India of total expenditure, how much of it is controlled at the lower level, we are absurd. Elsewhere, in our case, 3% of government expenditure is controlled at the lowest level, whereas in many other countries it's between 15 and 20%. We really need to rethink this, but the biggest mistake is to think that this is a center state problem. It's not a center state problem. It's a within state problem. Unwillingness to do.
So I have a quick point on that. When we talk about center state, there is also a private sector, right? We talk about the government, right? We're talking about the central and the state government. But you see the private sector outperform the government every time in almost majority of the sectors, whether telecom was there in the early mid-90s, what happened with BSNL, MTNL, and how the private telecom companies came and they did the wiring, cable laying, everything, right? But it is still valid but do you think that why I've spoken healthcare and education? Because I feel these are basic needs for our country, right? Do you feel that still the government should be involved in the healthcare?
Absolutely. Let me put it this way. I'm not in favor of saying the government should get out and either schooling or healthcare. Not at all. For our country, you need a public supported health and education system. Along with that, you should allow a private system. Because the problem in our case is the idea that you will have a private system delivering to, let's say, 80-90% of our population is not relevant. Okay? But certainly the top 10%, they typically want a higher level of care. That is a full look. If they want to buy Mercedes cars rather than Suzuki cars, then they want comparable differences in education and health also. You can't have the government subsidizing all of this, so let them set up their own schools, and that's fine. But I think that if you want these as public goods, they must be run by the state. Tragedy is that for most of these, they're not being controlled at the level at which the public would see that their elected representatives are either letting them down or not letting them. And that's what we need.
So you spoke about my last segment. You spoke about Viksit Bharat a couple of times. I'll tell you my viewpoint then before I come to the India being developed, because you're part of 91. We spoke about that part. I feel that I truly believe in the India story. I feel that as an entrepreneur, it is the best time to, whether you're working in India or building a business in India. I feel is the, in terms of growth expectation, that's going to happen. So my question to you is that, do you think there are, data or statements, right, that by 2047, then 100 years of independence would be there, India would be a developed country? Like, my question to you is that, will India be ever developed? If yes, when do you see India being a developed country?
That's both a very important and a very good question. So let me preface all this by saying I'm now 80 years old. So in one sense, for me, it's hypothetical. But on the other hand, I have grandchildren. And therefore, it's very important that by 2047, which is only 23 years or so away, that India should be as close as possible to a developed country. Okay? If you ask me, we're growing at about 7% now, and Niti Aayog says 7% is the lowest level consistent with development. So are we going to become developed anyway? The short answer is no. Because 7%, as I said earlier, includes the rebound factor of the COVID pandemic. We have to see whether in the next few years we are able to maintain 7%. Okay. And if we don't maintain 7%, it's a signal that, look, what you're doing is not enough. Between now and 2047, is everything we need to do already in place so that we have to do nothing else? Definitely not. And even the government, all government spokesmen say that we have to reform. I mean, the only thing is nobody is quite clear exactly what reform we need. There are broad categories, but they're not detailed. So my overall view is that India can achieve 7%. It would be wrong to say that we are on track now. We don't have to do anything new in order to achieve it. We have to do a lot of things which are very different and take a lot of new initiatives. Some of them will require new programs, government programs. Some of them require policy changes. And you have to identify what are these policy changes and what are these programs, and where they are government programs. How do you finance them? Are you going to finance them through more taxation? In which case you need to say what taxation? Are you going to finance them by cutting down other expenditures? In which case you need to build support for cutting down some useless expenditures. Are you going to finance that by selling off the public sector? Which is a good idea in my view. But then you should say that quite clearly. I mean, for example, in my view, we've just poured a huge amount of money into MTNL. It was completely unnecessary. I think you should privatize MTNL. You do not need public sector telephone system which is making as many losses as our two companies are making. We've privatized Air India, which is good. We have to now see what the private sector does with it. But if they don't do well with it, some other airline will come. I personally think that government expenditure will need to increase as a percent of GDP if we are to do all the things needed in order to reach a developed country status. And that will require better taxation, getting rid of dysfunctional expenditures, and privatizing public assets. All three need to be done. And maybe if we are talking about these long-term horizons, we need to spell out how are we going to do this? We've not seen that spelled out so far. Same thing is true on sustainability. I think it's an excellent target that India should get to net zero by 2070. The only other specific target we have is that we need to get 500 gigawatts or so non-fossil fuel capacity in electricity. That's for 2030. I mean, internationally now, there's pressure on all countries to make its targets more specific. Yeah. We should have a target up to 2035. How much is going to be renewable? How is it going to be built? what are the policy changes we need to achieve that objective? And that should be spelled out, not so much because people don't know. People know. I mean, I think people in the government know. There's enough expertise. You need to make this public so that people can sort of be aware. And when they talk about sustainability, this is what we're going to do.
But do you think that every year on year, if we grow at 7-8% by 2047, let's say every year from today, 7 to 10% in between 8%, let's say 8%. Do you feel that India will be a developed country in 2047?
If they grow at that, by definition, per capita income will be what it is. But whether it is well distributed depends on the nature of growth. Whether we are a stable society or a highly unstable one depends on whether the growth generates enough employment. So the definition of a developed society just means that if you're with our present level of income, if GDP grows 7-8%, we'll get there. But what does it mean getting there with the poor not benefiting, youth being unemployed? That's not what we mean. But all the other things we discussed, education, women participation, health, etc., that needs to happen in parallel. And for that to happen in parallel, you need to spell out what are the programs and policies that will achieve it. And that's very controversial. It's difficult to spell out. In my view, it cannot be spelled out for the long term. Next 5 years, next 10 years, we should have an agenda. Next 10 years, what are we going to do? And I think the public should be told. I'll give you one simple example. We are currently giving free rations up to 5 kg per person to something like 75% of the population. There is certainly no justification for this when we become a reality. Okay? Can we agree that we're going to phase this out in the next, let us say, 20 years? That would mean that in the next 5 years, this free ration of 5 kg will be reduced from 75% to 65%. 5 years after that, reduced to 50%, then reduced to 25%, and then finally to 10%. If somebody were to make that as a public statement,
हार देंगे election पे
huh?
सारे political parties
No, you have to think about it. Is that so?
Yeah.
I mean, is there nobody capable of explaining to the public कि अगर आप और देश अगर developed हो गया तो इसकी क्या जरूरत है? I think I disagree with you. We should be frank with the public and explain to them. Now, obviously, you cannot do all this if you're not getting 7% growth. So I would say that if 5 years from now, if we get 7% growth, this entitlement will be reduced by so much.
You want to spell it out now?
I think, because otherwise, frankly, it is not very helpful to spell out a long-term view when...
no short-term plans.
Yeah. If 50% of the population is probably going to be dead by 2047, then what's the point of spelling out something? It has value if it's seen as a goal. In order to achieve that goal, you have to get this way. Then you monitor whether you're on track or not. That's the critical thing.
Is there any message to young policy makers, economists who want to become like a Montek Singh Ahluwalia?
No, I think they should be better than us. Look, we changed very slowly. In 1991, we were conscious of the fact that people were not used to reforms. People were not used to the market economy. We knew it would take a long time. Today, people should be more aware. Starting in 1991, how much have we achieved? One of the interesting things in this period is that different governments have more or less adhered to the same notion that they must do reform. Now, none of them will agree that they did the same thing. Obviously, in political life, you don't expect political parties to say that we did the same thing. They'll say we did it better, we did something. But the important thing is continuity. So I think for the next 20 years, young people should first make up their mind. Are we going to see not just changes in end results, but changes in how we do things? If they say, yes, we do, then they should be made to think, what are those changes going to be? For example, Are you going to reintroduce import controls? Is that a good idea? Not a good idea. Are you going to reintroduce raising import duties? Is that a good idea or not a good idea? That way you need to move from what I would call broad slogans, which are good, to more specific programs and policies.
Yeah.
And which programs are good as opposed to not so good.
Yeah.
That also requires a very clear method of assessing the effectiveness of programs. And that should be made public, and you build support on it, etc., etc.
So I, like you, I believe in the India story, and I think the next 20, 25 years, I feel that we youngsters, I think the young generation in India have a lot to do, as you rightly said, a lot to think strategically. And I feel that, India, if you all contribute towards inclusivity and ensure that we uplift the society to become a better tomorrow, I think we can truly make a difference. So it was an absolute pleasure speaking to you and recording this marathon podcast with you. Thank you for being so candid and speaking your mind.
No, thank you. It's a great pleasure and a privilege. I will only conclude by saying your basic message to youth should not be look forward to a prosperous India. It should be please try to agree on the controversial things that we need to do in order to make that possible. I have no doubt that if you address 1 million young people and you say, you want an India which is united, less inequality, more employment, better jobs for women, everybody will agree.
Yeah.
But try to find some of the more controversial things and say, do you agree on that? And when you start seeing an agreement on that, politicians will be able to make progress.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for doing this with us. And we hope this reaches a lot of people and it creates impact and it forces them to think more critically moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.